So here's our chance to turn that narrative on that we just heard around. So the women's health is understudied and underfunded. So by generating this missing data and bringing the strongest data scientists to the table, we can drive discovery and fill this gender data gap. To this end, the seminar series will be devoted to both highlighting research that is currently being done in the field and to identify important gaps that exist so we may all work to fill them. We encourage discussion at the end of the talk. We're going to be putting these on YouTube, so we'll hold the Q&A till the end, which we'll moderate. And our hope is that these seminars will serve as a springboard for collaborations and new ideas to tackle issues related to women's brain health. I would also like to particularly call on the computational neuroimagers and AI experts who are joining us. We need your help in analyzing all of the really interesting women's brain health data we'll be collecting over the next several years through the WBHI. With that, I'd like to introduce you to our inaugural speaker in this seminar series, my longtime friend and colleague, Dr. Emily Jacobs. Dr. Jacobs is the director of the Anna Spowers at WBHI and is an associate professor at UC Santa Barbara. She completed her neuroscience PhD at Berkeley, and she was an instructor in the Division of Women's Health at Brigham and Women's Hospital at Harvard prior to moving to UCSB in 2016. She has been named a Hellman Fellow, a Brain and Behavior Young Investigator, a Robert Wood Johnson Foundation Health and Society Scholar, an NIH Women's Health Fellow, and a National Academy of Sciences Frontiers in Science Fellow for Distinguished Young Scientists under 45. And recently in 2022, she was named top 10 scientists to watch by Science News. In addition to her research, the Jacobs Lab advocates for diversity in science at a national and international level, and her lab regularly partners with K through 12 groups throughout the Central Coast to advance girls' representation in STEM, which is really important work that is featured in the book STEMinists, the life work of 12 women scientists and engineers. So with that, I'll turn it over to Emily.
Thank you so much, Amy and Jaren, for organizing this event, and all of the co-hosts, Milan, everybody who's here, and all of you for joining us. This is such a special moment for all of us. So we had the launch of the Women's Brain Health Initiative, now Institute, back in November. And since then, it has been, every day has been such a whirlwind in such a good way. So we really wanted to kick off a seminar series that can help support some of these efforts of really getting the people who are in this women's health space paired up with the best minds in computational neuroscience, data science, the application of sort of advanced imaging methods, so we can really keep our foot on the gas and really accelerate the pace of discoveries, as Amy, so eloquently said. So I'm happy to kick things off. I'm even more excited to see all of the talks that are to come in this monthly virtual seminar series. So officially, welcome to the launch of the Anna Spowers Women's Brain Health Institute seminar series. I think today is a celebration. It's also a call to action. So I want to start by putting this moment in a historical context. And this is probably not news to anybody who self-selected to be on this webinar, but the male body has been treated as the standard in science for centuries, right? Dating back to the time of antiquity when women were described as unknowable. And these are the same forces that pervade our era, right? This is a time when biomedical research in animals is conducted primarily in males, and when it took an act of Congress, literally, to require the enrollment of women into clinical trials. As the British historian Eleanor Cleghorn writes in a luminous book called Unwell Women, she says, "Our body is not elusive to us, but something about our body seems to thwart and frustrate medicine at every turn. And our lives depend on medicine learning to listen." Look, women are the majority of the population, but we are not yet seen as the norm. So it's become clear to many of us on this call that elevating women's health research is going to require a global shift in science culture. That shift starts now, right? It starts with all of us using the tools and the talent and the resources that we have to push for change. Now, historically, most of what we know about health and disease centers on the male body, and yet 70% of Alzheimer's patients are women. 2 out of every 3 people who suffer from depression are women. And there are some conditions that only people with a uterus will experience, things like postpartum depression, perimenopausal brain fog, right? And these deserve our attention. And we are not paying attention as a field. Women are half the population, but only 10% of the NIH budget goes to conditions that primarily affect women, 10%. So yeah, women's health research is grossly underfunded. It's also understudied. And this is really why we're all sort of here today, right? So here's just one example. So when MRI technology entered the mainstream in the early to mid 90s, it gave neuroscientists unprecedented access to the living human brain. Right? Suddenly we had a way to understand how the brain works when it's healthy and what goes wrong when it's not. So since that time, since the early 90s, over 50,000 articles have been published on the human brain, represented by this kind of blue wave. And then if you squint really, really hard, you might be able to detect this thin black line at the bottom. That's everything that we know about how the brain responds to pregnancy, menopause, the menstrual cycle, hormonal contraception, and so much more. So of those 50,000 articles, less than half of 1% consider health factors specific to women, right? Less than half of 1%. That's the data, the proverbial fork crumbs. So to put it another way, neuroscience has overlooked aspects of the human condition that are relevant to half of the world's population. It's why we don't know more about birth control-related depression or how the brain responds to menopause or pregnancy, among other essential questions. It's not that we can't find out, it's that the field as a whole hasn't really bothered. So when we talk about the scientific body of knowledge, we've got to consider whose body does it serve? And here's the thing, these topics are relatively unknown, but they are knowable. And we now find ourselves in this really unique opportunity to help buck the trend. So as Amy said, the mission of the Bowers Women's Brain Health Initiative is to close the gender data gap, to fill the void, to peer into that very thin black hole of a line and make it our entire universe. So here at the Bowers WBHI, we are driven by an almost radically simple idea, which is that progress in neuroscience will flourish when the health of men and women are valued equally. We are fueled by a commitment to make neuroscience inclusive, both in terms of who gets to ask the questions and who is served by the answers. And in this talk, I'm not going to sort of dive into the long history of sort of exclusionary practices of why women are underrepresented in STEM. I think other writers and scholars have talked about that. But it's a huge driver, I think, for why we're here today, right? There's this parallel between gender inequity in terms of who's asking the questions and who's served by the answers. So representation in science is not just a social justice issue, right? Having diversity in science can change the very nature of the questions we think to ask. And maybe that's a topic we can cover in another session, but it's one that I think is absolutely fundamental to our progress in the field. So I want to sort of step back and just give an introduction to kind of what the Women's Brain Health Initiative is today and how it's growing moving forward, to really kind of help set the stage for the data that we're having coming down the pipeline that will be accessible, and also the kinds of questions that we hope this seminar series can really start to dig into. So the Women's Brain Health Initiative was born out of another observation, which is that the current model of siloed science is failing us, to put it bluntly. So under the current status quo, often independent researchers work in isolation from one another, right? We have these brain imaging centers that churn out data for pretty small scale studies, and then the data stay disconnected. And this practice has led to underpowered data sets and pretty serious questions about replicability in our field. So, the Merrick et al. Article being sort of the one that sort of captured these problems. So it's, I think, becoming increasingly clear to the neuroimaging community that in a lot of ways, the lone investigator model of science is a dead end. The model also overlooks the single most important feature of our university, right? University of California. So we are one university with campuses spread out, sort of like tentacles, across this geographically and demographically diverse state, which is the 5th largest economy in the world. So on their own, these UC campuses rival other leading institutions, but combined, there may be no other university system like it on the planet, right? And that's in part what made this initiative possible. That's why we're here, to dissolve the silos and rewrite the rules of how science is done. Like, what if we pooled data and expertise across these campuses? What if we use that data to ask the questions that have laid dormant for way too long? So we're about to find out. The Bowers Women's Brain Health Initiative includes Santa Barbara, Irvine, UCSF, and Berkeley. We're about to get even bigger. Right? San Diego, Riverside, Davis are all being onboarded as we speak. And together, these brain imaging centers generate data from thousands of MRI participants every year. So this consortium science approach, I think in a lot of ways harkens back to the model of genomics and astrophysics or particle physics, where you get this massive amount of data that are collected and only through joint endeavors. And embracing big data ushered in major discoveries for those fields. And we can do the same for neuroscience. And Human Connectome Project and the Adolescent Brain and Cognitive Development Project demonstrate the power of a big data approach. So now let's do the same for women's brain health, right? Let's study tens of thousands of women in ways that no one else has, and with data that the UC system can help generate in partnership with other institutions around the world. So at the Bowers WBHI, we do 3 things. We help generate the missing data. We build the infrastructure to share that data. And we develop AI tools to answer far-reaching questions about women's brain health. And you're going to hear in this series from people who occupy sort of all nodes of this sort of trifecta or triptych, if you will. So under this model, research teams can join forces to carry out consortium-level science. And then researchers around the globe will be able to access this data to make discoveries, yielding a huge return on investment if we're lucky. So from the very beginning, our goal has been to pair the best data with the best methods and the best minds. This is a deeply collaborative effort, right? It requires engineers and data scientists and MRI technologists, neurologists, epidemiologists, women's health scholars, brain imaging center directors, an operations team, right? Everybody working in concert. So I like to say that this is the opposite of siloed science. And we're just getting started, right? We are growing rapidly and would love to have input from anybody interested in helping us move this field forward. Okay, so what about the data? As scientists, as you know, right, data is our currency. It's like the thing that does the heavy lifting and solves the problems and changes lives if we gather it correctly, right? So we need better data, that much is clear. And at the Bowers WBHI, this initiative strikes at 3 levels: by going broad, by going deep, and by getting really precise. So these are the 3 tenets of the WBHI. So right now, we're focused on building the infrastructure and tools to generate these 3 critical kinds of data. So first, as I mentioned, we go broad, right? So we're collecting MRI data on a massive number of women right now across the University of California system, because we think big data paired with the computational horsepower of AI, will help us understand how certain health factors like hormonal contraceptives influence the brain. So with thousands of data points, we'll finally be able to ask questions like whether hormonal contraceptive use early in life or early in adolescence can influence the trajectory of brain development. We'll gain traction on why some people on the pill experience negative side effects like depression, while others experience benign or even positive outcomes. Answers to these questions are long overdue, especially for the 400 million women around the world who are currently on these medications, right? We need better data so that women can make informed decisions, weighing the considerable benefits of these medications against potential costs. And this is just one example of the many questions that we're asking in this trans-UC database, which we think of as kind of like an incubator, right, that can help identify priority areas of investigation and act as a springboard for federally funded subsidiary studies. So this is like our sandbox, our playground. Second, we go deep, right? Brains do not exist in a vacuum, and deep phenotyping allows us to collect a rich set of data from each person. So in addition to the brain, we can collect blood for proteomic analyses or deploy wearable devices to monitor sleep, cognition, and mood. We can zoom out even further to geography level data, right, to understand how the broader social and environmental determinants of brain health. This is, more or less deep phenotyping as we see it, zooming in and out to make connections between the micro and the macro. So with the Bowers WBHI infrastructure in place, expanding the diversity of data that we collect is now possible. And in future lectures, you're going to hear from leaders in deep phenotyping who are primed to lead these efforts. And third, we get really precise. So in contrast to big data's approach of collecting one snapshot of the brain on a massive amount of people, what if we collected a massive amount of data on individuals? So this is an emerging area of neuroscience called precision imaging. And we can capture the brain as it moves, as it changes over time with startling temporal resolution, right? This gives us almost unprecedented access to the brain as it moves through major endocrine transitions like pregnancy and menopause. So for example, we've charted how the maternal brain changes week by week across gestation through 2 years postpartum. And based on this work and pioneering work from Susan Carmona's group, we now think that the maternal brain may hold some of the greatest mysteries of the brain, right? Like its ability to undergo directed plasticity in adulthood. So the brain holds superpowers if we just know where and how to look. And I think beyond shedding light on basic biology, these kinds of precision monitoring techniques, whether we're looking at the blood or the brain or any other kind of data point, these are probably going to be key for discovering the earliest possible indicators of conditions like postpartum depression. And early detection means access to early intervention, right? And that's going to have long-lasting consequences and implications for the mother and child. So with these 3 tenets of the Bowers WBHI, to go broad, to go deep, and to go precise, our goal is to generate the most diverse and comprehensive collection of data ever acquired for women's brain health. And in all cases, the ethos of the WBHI is that once the data are in hand, we simply give it away. We collect it and then release it open access to the global science community so that the discoveries never stop. So as this monthly lecture series unfolds, you're going to hear from top minds in women's health, in neuroimaging, and in data science. For example, you'll hear from folks like Dr. Rachel Buckley, who will talk about how to use the infrastructure of the WBHI to launch the most comprehensive study of brain health and menopause to date. Dr. Judy Pa is thinking about the nuggets of gold we already have access to today. So 30 years of data from clinical trials that the field can start to mine with AI. And in the months ahead, Dr. Amy Kusieski and Dr. Nina Milan will discuss how to wield AI tools on multidimensional neuroimaging data. Amy and Nina are co-directors of the Bowers WBHI AI Core. You'll hear from folks like Dr. Russ Poldrack, who will discuss transforming the scale at which neuroscience research is done with an open access data sharing platforms, is Open Neuro. And Russ is director of the Bowers WBHI Data Coordination Center. So as you join us for these sort of series and you listen to these talks, just remember that we are working to transform women's brain health. We are at this sort of crucial moment where we're building momentum, and we need all of you at the table to help us get started and to expand. Again, this is not siloed science. This is deeply collaborative, and we would love all of your efforts and to learn from you and to work with you along the way. So I want to just dig in into why this matters a little bit more. And to do so, I want to talk about two leading causes of disability worldwide. That's depression and dementia. So here are two disorders in which women outnumber men 2 to 1. As I mentioned earlier, of the 6.7 million Americans living with dementia today, 2/3 of them are women. And we see a similar pattern with depression, where women are at about twice the lifetime risk relative to men. So what happens if we take a step back and we think about these disorders through the lens of women's health? You start to see a really interesting pattern emerge. For example, over the life course, the incidence of depression tends to co-occur with endocrine transition states: puberty, hormonal contraceptive use, the postpartum period, perimenopause. We know that early menopause is a risk factor for dementia. In particular, early surgical menopause, typically thought of as before the age of 40, is associated with greater burden of neuritic plaques at autopsy. And you'll hear about this sort of work in the series ahead. And it's clear to us that gaining traction on these disorders depends on our willingness to invest in women's health. And I'd love to just draw your attention to a wonderful review by Claudia Barth, Lisa Galea and colleagues that came out last year that really sort of walks through the logic of why this lens is so important to gaining traction on disorders that have an obvious medical burden on women, but also a huge economic burden. If money's your driver, then that's also the problem. So gaining traction on these disorders depends on our willingness to invest in women's health. And guess what? We're not doing that. We have not done that. As Dr. Galea and I wrote in a special issue of Frontiers in Neuroendocrinology that she put out a couple years ago now, she's always sort of at the forefront of these ideas. We write that neuroscience has overlooked aspects of the human condition, like the menstrual cycle, the pill, pregnancy, menopause, that are relevant to half of the world's population and half of the US tax base. And we've got to correct course for the field to advance. And I think implicit in this argument is sort of even stepping beyond sex differences, as the title of this special issue was, right? We've got to center women's brain health as a phenomenon worthy of study in and of itself. So again, that's why we're here. That's why this seminar launched. So here are just a kind of amuse-bouche, a sort of smattering of the topics that we will cover, thinking about hormonal contraceptives, hearing from leaders in the field of thinking about matrescence and the brain changes that happen over pregnancy with Susana Carmona, Magdalena Martinez-Garcia, and more. I think there's even exciting work to think about in terms of sort of hormone-based conditions, endocrine-based conditions that affect women, like PCOS and endometriosis. And there's been, I think, 2 brain imaging studies ever published on endometriosis. One that just came out on PCOS, which is clearly making this case that these disorders don't stop in the reproductive tract. We need to think about these as sort of whole body, including brain conditions, and neuroscience has a real opportunity to kind of gain insight into both the conditions and how treatment responses might help all organs, including the brain. Huge opportunity to make headway there. We'll dive into amazing work that's been happening using these sort of precision monitoring, precision imaging techniques to track the brain across endocrine transitions like the menstrual cycle. There's been just amazing work from so many groups to think about how these endogenous cycles are really shaping the brain in super cool ways. You'll hear from folks like Laura Pritchett, who sort of submitted herself to science by doing daily MRIs and blood draws to map the human brain across the complete menstrual cycle, and then again in response to hormonal contraception. Folks like Julia Sacker, Claudia Barth, Karina Heller, Rachel Zito have published absolutely phenomenal work in this space. So there's really this sort of exciting momentum to use these deep phenotyping or precision imaging techniques. So using MRI sort of in new, interesting ways to uncover the dynamic properties of the human brain in a way that really had sort of hadn't been tackled before. So in addition to thinking about the human imaging community, we would love to bring in folks who are really doing, kind of pushing the boundaries of knowledge using imaging techniques in animal models, really to kind of draw some translational understanding between what we're seeing at the human level and folks are seeing in the animal model. So here's just one example. We're going to hear from labs using longitudinal 2-photon imaging that to track spines on apical dendrites in hippocampal CA1 neurons over the mouse estrous cycle. So this is like precision imaging for mice. And then they're using calcium imaging to understand how these spine changes can influence the functional properties of hippocampal neurons. And then going in and using CRISPR to understand how certain receptor types modulate this really tightly controlled dance. So we think this is really important to really think broadly about what are the latest and greatest methods that could be leveraged, maybe that's kind of used to study one domain, but could easily be kind of co-opted to make major advancements for understanding basic principles of how hormones influence the brain. So we'll hear from those folks as well. Just to give another shout out to Dr. Carmona and Dr. Martinez Garcia. They just last week published this phenomenal paper thinking about matrescence and the neuroplasticity that happens across motherhood. So we're grateful to have them as our scientific advisors and fellows on this project, and you'll hear from them in future months. And we'll hear from folks in my group who are studying the brain's response to 3 different types of menopause: spontaneous menopause, pharmacological menopause, and surgical menopause, among many other topics, which I'll sort of show here, but won't do a deep dive into today. And one thing that I want to mention that's sort of an implicit thorn in people's sides is this idea of hormones being sort of bandied about as a pejorative, right? When you call a woman hormonal, first of all, it's often lobbed at a woman, and it's often seen as this sort of problem. But hormones aren't a problem. I think Rebecca Shansky had a great article. I think it was called like, "Are hormones a female problem?" And the answer is no, they're not a problem at all. And they're certainly not something that only influences the female sex. Hormones are these critical neuromodulators for all sexes. But one thing that I wanted to sort of get into for just a minute, if you'll allow me to, everybody here is probably familiar with the sex as a biological variable, or SABV mandate. This was issued by the NIH in 2016 to reverse the decades-old practice of favoring the study of male animals in preclinical research, right? So Annelies Beery and Irv Zucker's 2011 report in Neuroscience and Biobehavioral Reviews sort of quantified this problem that males were overrepresented in preclinical research. And then the NIH followed this up with this mandate to try to correct course. But one of the justifications for the use of male animals was this idea that females were unknowable because we had these cycles, right? We had this menstrual cycle, and that created unwanted variability that made us unknowable, unstudyable, right? It was too much variation in the field. So I just want to be really clear that sort of this foundational argument, right, for excluding female animals because their estrous cycle renders them too variable to include in research, that assumption fails all empirical testing. This variability myth has been discredited across species, from mice to rats to humans. So no, these cycles don't make us unknowable. They are really interesting drivers of some changes across the body, including the brain, but they certainly aren't a reason to exclude the study of women. In fact, they could be really interesting ways of understanding this feature of how the brain works. So right now, the kind of preclinical world, I think, is focused on inclusion, right? There's a big topic in the animal world right now, and just generating the samples that will allow for analysis by sex. But the issue for human neuroscience, and what this seminar series is all about, it's a little different, right? So inclusion is not our core problem. Men and women are enrolled in large numbers across most brain imaging studies. And many studies have probed for sex differences in the human brain. But when a sex difference is reported, it's often with a lack of intuition regarding the neurobiological mechanisms or sociocultural effects that can lead to individual variation in the brain. So I would just want to give an example of a step in the right direction. This is from a paper that came out in 2022. Sheila Shanmugam and colleagues used Human Connectome Project HCP data to identify sex differences in the brain's functional topography. And they found that certain association networks like the default mode and ventral attention, these are the most distinct between individuals and by sex. And then they used transcriptomic data from the Allen Human Brain Atlas to show that sex differences in these brain network patterns were spatially coupled to the expression of genes on the X chromosomes. So starting to kind of dig into the how of these patterns that we can see sort of at the meso or macroscopic scale. And sort of a final point before I wrap up, these sorts of microarray data can be a really powerful tool for linking regional expression, regional gene expression with macroscopic features of brain structure and function. But a huge caveat is that the Allen Human Brain Atlas is based on, unless I haven't looked in the last few months, but right now is based on 6 postmortem samples, only one of whom is female. So one practical thing we need to do moving forward is to ensure that we have representative atlases and databases so we can generate knowledge that's relevant to everyone on this call. The philosophers are always ahead of the game. And in 1994, the philosopher Kathleen Akrulik wrote this. It's a little long, but I think it captures the essence of why we're here and why the WBHI got started and why the seminar series launched. She writes that the treatment of menstruation, pregnancy, and childbirth as diseases or medical emergencies can be traced to the fact that these are not things that happen to the ideal healthy human, who is, of course, male. The ideal healthy lab rat is also male. His bodies, his hormones, and his behaviors define the norm, so he is used in experiments. Female hormones and their effects are just nuisance variables that muck up the works, preventing experimenters from getting at that pure, clean, stripped-down essence of rathood, as instantiated by the male model. She goes on to say that the dangerous effects of such research procedures, especially in the biomedical sciences, are just now being documented. And for far too long, the assumption underlying these experimental designs that males are the norm, it simply went unchallenged. So I know I'm beating a dead horse, so to speak, but women are the majority of the population, but we are not yet seen as the norm. And we have got to correct course for the field to advance. So when we think about the current status of women's health, it can be easy, to get a little angry, but there is so much to be hopeful about. The president just announced the first ever White House initiative on women's health research. This is led by Dr. Jill Biden. Carolyn Missouri is the scientific lead. Super exciting time to have representation at the highest level in the federal government. And even on the other branch of government, earlier this year, there was a bipartisan bill that was introduced to bolster federal support for menopause research. It's not a done deal, but at least it's a start. And lots of our sort of publishing friends and colleagues have done a tremendous amount to create a platform for these conversations to unfold. Here, I'll just mention the kind of Nature family journals are making huge inroads into providing a space for us to share this research, to talk about these issues. And I just want to give a big shout out to Mary Elizabeth Sutherland, Jean Zerat, and Sherry Weissman, who have been absolutely tour de forces into taking some of the biggest publishing platforms in the world and giving space for women's health writ large, including women's brain health. So yeah, if you haven't seen the news, they're launching this new series as a starting point for these sorts of discussions to unfold. I always like to end with a few words from some of the wisest people out there. This one from the late, great Toni Morrison. So the story goes, she was once asked by a white interviewer whether her books would ever feature white characters in a significant way. And in her response, she says, "You can't possibly imagine how racist that question is. You are used to being in the center, and it's inconceivable to you that I could ever be mainstream." And then when the interviewer goes on to inquire further about how Morrison was able to find such far-reaching success as a Black writer, she says, "I stood at the border, I stood at the edge, and I claimed it as central. I let the rest of the world move over to where I was." So I think now is the time to gain some lessons from Morrison. Now is the moment for women to claim themselves as central. We've got to claim the study of our bodies on our terms. And to do that, we need scientists and leaders whose vision isn't blurred by the lack of lived experience. The folks that you're going to hear throughout this lecture series are working really hard to accelerate the pace of discovery for women's brain health, but we can't do it alone, right? Everyone has a role to play, and we've got to make progress together. So one question for us all to consider is, how do we as a society, how do we as a collection of scientists and scholars, how do we start to hasten this along? So I'll just end there. You are welcome to go to the website to learn more about the initiative, and then absolutely be sure to tune in to our next event, next month, that will feature our own Dr. Amy Kusiewski talking about the application of AI for women's brain health. So with that, we'll be happy to open it up and take questions.